This time I'm looking at flow of control, i.e. how does a program decide what it's going to do and how often it should do it. Now, the first half of this is the if-then statements that I've looked at, and also the switch statement, which decides which part of it the program is going to execute. This time around, though, we're looking at the loop constructs, iterating ways of repeating the same instruction again and again and again, much like me recording this video half a dozen times. So, first up of this whole set, I'm only going to be covering the first three listed here, but we have the while loop. And the while loop's actually nice and simple. We have a starting point, and then we decide, are we going to execute or do this additional part of the program? And if the test, the statement here inside the brackets, is true, then we'll do whatever's in there. And we'll keep doing it until it becomes false. Once it's false, we exit and go on to whatever else we're going to be dealing with. So best way to start is with a simple example in C#. So in this case, I need to have a control variable that will decide whether or not the loop is finished. And I set it to false. And all it's really doing is just, it's a flag. It goes yes, no, whatever, and that's it. So while not finished, we do a thing. So open the curly braces, and then we decide what we're going to do. So in this case, it's just going to be really simple. I'm just trying to create the basic structure. Press C to continue. Hopefully I've spelled that right. If it's wrong, I'll come back to it later. Oops, that needs to end with a semicolon. All right, now I need to actually decide what's going to happen. And I haven't used this before in the programming with you guys, but quite simply, if I do a console read key allows me to pull a key pressed into the keyboard. And in this case, I'm comparing that key with a console key, in this case, the letter C. And I could put more curly braces in here, but I don't need to because it is a single command, which I'm just signing the value to true. That's it. And console clear, just to clean up the mess I'm making. So, and as good practice here, I'm just going to mark in the end of the while loop. Really, it's good practice to sort of mark the ends of it, because that way you know where it begins, you can see the statement, and you know where it ends, it's clearly marked. So if I just test this with a quick F5, it will run through the thing and wait for me to press the correct key. So every time I press a key, it will be waiting. And if I finally get around to pressing C, it exits. So that's good. If I press F5 just to test again, because it should, yep, press C to continue, press C, and it goes out. Great. So this statement, I've got this initial condition that basically could be anything. Is the game running? Or does the player have more than 0 lives? If they don't, or while they do have more than 0 lives, or more than a negative number of lives, or whatever it is, then play the game. Otherwise, exit, the game's over. That's it. So here you can set up fairly complicated conditions. I haven't talked about complicated conditions yet, because that sort of requires a bit of an understanding of Boolean logic and how and or not statements combine. But we're just going through the basic ideas at the moment, and then we'll supplement with some additional stuff later on. So the second statement in this whole string of things is the do while loop. And so with the while loop, it doesn't even have to execute once. It can come here, hit here, and go on and exit, and that's it. With the do while loop, it has to do it once. So it does a thing, then tests, and if it's still true, keeps going. Otherwise, it just exits. And excuse me. So here, this will execute at least once times. It's referred to as a post-test loop. In other languages, it's referred to as a repeat until. So it keeps repeating a thing until a condition is met. So jumping back to C#, let's have a look at what we're going to do with this one. So in here, I'm just going to put in a counter equal to 0 just to know how many times this loop has actually gone through. The starting of it is actually really simple. It's a do. Great. What are we going to do? Well, we then decide, and this one will make sense once I'm done it. Counter plus plus. Now, the other thing I haven't covered with you guys is the counter plus plus thing, but I'll get back to that in just a second. Because it doesn't take much to explain it. Basically, it's just add 1 to what you've just done. Q to quit. Done. All right, so that's a piece of code. And so while console.read key is here is not equal to the letter C. So if they press, the letter Q. If they press anything except Q, it's going to keep repeating. And I'm just going to put that in there because you need to, with this one, you need to clear the, have a semicolon at the end to make sure it terminates the statement. Whereas with a standard while loop, you don't. So it's something to be aware of. Anyhow, then we have a clear console and a right line of the counter. So I'm just going to cut and paste that slab of text there, cut that from there and dump that inside the statement and get rid of that extra stuff. So before I'll execute this and I'll talk about the code that's in here. So here we have a plus plus. The plus plus is basically an increment or add 1 to the current variable. It's the equivalent of counter equals counter plus 1. That's it. Not particularly complicated, but worth knowing. You also have a decrement, which takes away 1. And there's two other variations with that, and there's a couple other shortcuts with doing calculations, but I'll cover them in due course. All right, so pressing the letter C, nothing happens. Pressing the letter Q, I press Q, and then I press 6 other keys. So here it's that sort of repetitive structure to sort of get to the answer. All right, finally, oh boy, we have the for loop. Now the for loop runs a predefined amount of times. Great, nice and simple. The only hassle with it, of course, is we've got to set up our counting variable, our test conditions to say, well, we will run only when this happens, and then what happens at the end of each loop, and then, of course, what we're going to do. So the setup, deciding whether or not we're going to loop, do our thing, and then modify the loop variable usually. Easiest to see in C, so we have a command called for. I need to set up a loop variable, so I loop 1 equals 0. Great, that's set up, increment, and I loop 1 is less than 5. So in this case, the test condition is it's less than 5. All right, I loop plus plus. And this is where the plus plus stuff comes in, because this is where it starts to become useful because it's nice shorthand. So what am I going to do at this point? Well, I am going to do a console.write just a single star. That will do. So if I test it, and you'll notice as I go through this, I'm testing each little chunk at a time, and it's good practice to get into. So C to continue, Q to quit, and I'll get 5 stars. I'm now going to introduce an error, and this is something you will need to watch out for when you create these programs. I'll run that again. This creates what's called an infinite loop, and it was mentioned in that list. So if I go C, Q, and here it is going on forever, and it will keep going and never stop, and you notice the process memory is loading up here. So we're suffering a little bit. So with all of these loops, they can suffer what's called an infinite loop, where the exit condition will never be made false, I suppose. So here, if I change that to true, that will always do what it's doing. If I do and then change that to true, it will always just keep doing it. So with each of these conditions, which is in this one, the middle statement, you need to be really cautious about making sure that it will exit. Sometimes it's going through a process called hand tracing, where you trace through the commands one at a time and follow the flow of control, and that sort of stuff. Now, what I'm going to do here is get into a little bit of what they call scope. So this variable is created and only exists from this point to that point. It doesn't exist at any other point. So if I then create another variable that has the same name, C# is going to go, haha, no, you don't. And so it will create errors. So if you do this, make sure you actually really clear about your variable names. It's one of the reasons why you should be declaring your variables all the way at the top. And I know I've been fairly lazy with this, but looking at this is 3 separate examples. So that's why it's all broken up. Now in this one, take a look at this program, and with the initial loop variable, it starts from 0, and all these looping and indexing things start at 0 and will only keep running while the loop variable is less than 5. So it'll go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then exit. And that's 5 iterations. There's a whole reason as to why this stuff starts at 0, and it's probably more relevant to do with the next thing I'm going to be doing with the next tutorial as opposed to here. But basically you need to stay indexing of arrays, and I'll leave it at that, and we'll get back to that later. So if we look at this one, and I press F5 and run it, and then go CQ, what you'll see is you get 10 stars, 5 rows. If I swap these numbers around, I'll have 10 rows of 5 stars. And there we are. So that will be relevant to you guys creating the program that is in the booklet, but it's just a quick summary example of the different forms of looping. If I go back to here, you can see them here. There's also the for each loop. That's usable in certain situations, and basically just a variation of the for loop, but I'll leave it up to you to discover, and we'll get back to it. But that's pretty much it for this one. So thanks for your time.